more sense, gives more general framework.
All right, sounds good. I apologize about that. Mark, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the invitation. My name is Mark LaBelle. I'm a senior associate with the Regulatory Assistance Project. I work on a few different kinds of issues, utility rate making generally, including rate design and net metering reform, gas utility reform, a handful of other fun topics. The Regulatory Assistance Project in general, we do a bunch of different things. One of those is advising state agencies on cutting edge regulatory topics. Next slide, please. So real quick overview of my presentation today, talk about some high level principles and background on rate design, key design choices for time of use rates, and then a handful of real world examples. Next slide. Great. So just to start with the basics, there's typically 3 stages of a rate making process in a full rate case. Step 1 is determining the overall revenue requirement, the regulated revenue requirement. Step 2 is allocating costs among customer classes, typically residential, commercial, industrial, and street lighting. That's the simplest version. And then you're designing the end use retail rates for the individual customers. Each of these steps tends to have different principles and calculations involved, but this in every state does them a little differently. Next slide. So through the whole process of designing rates and sort of the higher level principles of rate structure, we have a few key goals in mind. One is to collect sufficient revenue for the utility and to have some measure of revenue stability. Second is fair cost apportionment among different customers and among different customer classes. Third is to incentivize efficient levels of usage by customers. And fourth is both feasibility and understandability for customers. Now, in practice, the different steps in this process interact with those goals in slightly different ways. At the cost allocation stage, it's primarily about group equity and across classes. At the rate design stage, it's primarily about efficient forward-looking incentives, customer understanding, and individual bill impacts. Next slide. So cost causation with rate design is an important underlying concept. Sometimes it's called, marginal system costs, same general concept. It's really about what characteristics of the system lead to the costs that are incurred. Nearly every element of the electric system is driven by the shared requirements of many customers. There are exceptions to that, of course, basic meters, most service drops, and some line transformers. And each function, generation, transmission, and distribution, has slightly different cost drivers. Fuel, wholesale energy, and contract purchase costs vary by time and different characteristics. Coincident peaks, often annual peaks, drive the overall amount of generation capacity that you need, while year-round load patterns determine the optimal mix of that capacity. Coincident peaks matter for transmission and distribution as well, of course, but line losses are another key consideration. And overall, we're often thinking about many different kinds of trade-offs when you're designing the electric system. That's different kinds of generation capacity, and there's often trade-offs between different kinds of capital investments and labor, fuel, et cetera, et cetera. Next slide, please. So I think one thing I like to emphasize is that these factors have not been the same over time, and that we have many features of our traditional electric regulatory system were designed in the middle of the last century, and some of the concepts and terminology that we've used for all this time may not be holding up. In particular, the demand classification, or what you call demand-related costs, that whole category may not make sense anymore. It's really hard to pin down what originally people were talking about specifically when they started using the phrase demand almost 100 years ago. But in many respects, they were talking about a combination of different things, including peak demand related costs, overall capacity needs, and overall reliability needs. And part of the reason this was so confusing last century is that there was a high degree of overlap between those concepts. But with many new generation technologies and other technology changes, those three concepts are becoming increasingly distinct, so that in the modern electric system, the term, the demand classification may no longer be a coherent concept that we can really hang our hat on. Next slide. And that key terminological fact really has implications for how you think about both cost allocation and rate design. It's no longer straightforward to have a simple split between demand and energy. And one thing you can do to reflect that is, instead of having a demand-related, energy-related, and customer-related as the key cost allocation categories, you can do time assignment for shared system costs instead. And that time assignment can mimic what you would like to do for rate design as well. So you can sort costs into different hour buckets, peak hours, intermediate hours, and all hours, including off-peak. So some of these, this is how the cost causation concepts that you use translate throughout the whole process. Next slide. So that's all by way of background. And now we're getting really to the nitty-gritty of how you start to think about designing your time of use rates. Arguably, the most important goal of time of use rate design is to improve the cost causation basis of rates, so that customers, both their investments and their behavior, is more efficient. When you're doing that, we want to avoid certain adverse impacts. We want to have revenue stability for the utility, and you want to have some semblance of bill stability for individual customers. And it's important to keep the rates understandable, and customers need to be able to manage their bills. And so there's at least 4 key design choices here that I'm going to talk about today. Which customers, what time patterns, which costs, and then how do you ensure customer understanding? Next slide. So at the highest level, this is often sort of in the background of rate cases because it was decided decades ago, and we just keep the same customer classes. But you can take another look at what the customer classes are. And then even within customer classes, some you can only apply time of use rates to certain subsets, or you can apply more complex time of use rates or other rate design innovations to subsets of individual classes. Next slide. When you're designing your time periods, there are a few different trade-offs. If your time periods are too narrow, particularly your peak is too narrow, you might miss the peak, or you might accidentally shift the peak without reducing it overall, thus losing a key efficiency goal. A really broad peak time of use period makes shifting load difficult for customers and penalizes customers without movable load. Adding time periods tends to be more accurate, going from 2 to 3 or 4 time periods, but is obviously more complex, both for the utilities and customers, and the regulators for that matter. There are a number of different options to manage all these different issues. You can have different peak periods for different rate classes so that there's slightly different incentives and you won't shift or miss the peak. You can have feathering for some customer classes where customers are allowed to choose different peak windows for themselves. And then over time, you can just start simple and then add complexity as customers gain understanding, and hopefully technology adoption improves as well. Next slide. So the question of which costs are driven by which hours can be a little complex as well, and it depends on how good your underlying cost of service data is. So of course, wholesale energy, fuel, and purchase power costs can be incurred at different time periods. All types of capacity costs are driven by, that's generation, transmission, and distribution, are driven by a mix of peak usage and year-round usage patterns. And many quote-unquote capacity investments are designed not just to address resource adequacy and peaking issues, but provide a range of benefits year-round. And then last but not least, many peak costs, it's a question of which peak. It's not necessarily a predictable everyday pattern or a predictable pattern. It's not the same every day of the summer, for example, but are really incurred by more frequent events, by extremely hot weather or another research outages or other things like that. So identifying the actual times in a given year that are driving these costs can be unpredictable. Next slide. So what's a very simple way to start to sort through these issues? This is too many categories to go through in detail, but you separate all the different costs into your buckets here. There's different categories of costs for distribution, transmission, and generation. And then on the next slide, this is all magically transformed into the hours where those costs are incurred, roughly speaking. So you have a narrow window for peaking costs. You have a mid-peak for the backbone of the transmission and distribution system, mid-merit generation. Baseload generation is capacity and energy costs are charged at all hours. And then demand response costs are the hours that the costs that are incurred at the very, very peaks of the year, less than 100 hours typically. Labeling that here as demand response, but it's a slightly broader category of costs that are incurred at the very peak. Next slide. So translating that into very roughly what a really good rate design for today, if you can do it, and you have the AMI and the other data, what a really good rate design for today might look like, and laid it out here separately for residential and medium commercial and industrial. I'll focus on the residential for the moment. You could have a tiered customer charge depending on the type of the residential customer, and then a 3-period time of use rate with a peak time rebate overlay. And the peak time rebate would not be an everyday occurrence, but would be based on a system call, a judgment by the utility that the following day typically is a day of extra need. We'll get to the Maryland example of that in a few minutes. Next slide, please. And then understandability is a key point, of course. Customers have to understand their rates and be able to manage their bills. The utilities and other policymakers, other people can have basic explanatory materials, particularly online, and then detailed data provision, green button, and other online tools can help too. Doing these transitions gradually can help diffuse knowledge. If you have one person on every block that understands it, they can help their neighbors with it, would be one approach to this. You can start with opt-in and then move to opt-out or mandatory. And as you add each level of complexity, you can do the same type of gradual transition again. There's other billing protections you can have, shadow billing and hold harmless. And then there's a bunch of companion programs that can be relevant as well. Energy efficiency programs more broadly, demand response programs, and then special low-income programs or other programs that help people avoid adverse impacts. Next slide. So I'll just run through a few real world examples. The simplest type of examples, this is Fort Collins, Colorado, has a mandatory time of use rate that's more drastic than some of the states that have adopted a mandatory time of use rate. Pretty high on-peak, off-peak differentials, and they have different peaking periods by season. So in the summer, 2 to 7 p.m. is the peak, but in the winter, 5 p.m. to 9 p.m. is the peak. Next slide. In Hawaii, with their special generation mix that's heavily solar, their off-peak period is actually the middle of the day. So this is increasingly an issue for states that have a lot of solar, mostly the Southwest and Hawaii. Who knows if the rest of the country is ever going to face quite this issue. Next slide. Burbank in California has a fun municipal optional time of use rate for EV owners that has a tiered customer charge and has a slightly different structure in the summer and in the winter. In the winter, there's only 2 time periods, but in the summer, they add on that 3rd peak time period. Next slide. Maryland has been an innovator with peak time rebates for residential customers. Customers are notified that the following day will be a peak savings day for specific hours, and then they get a credit for reductions below their baseline. How that's calculated is a little bit complicated, and hopefully customers have some understanding of what they're doing. But in general, I think customers get the message that they're supposed to try to conserve during the hours that have been identified in their notice. And of course, there's no penalty in the Maryland system for exceeding your baseline. You're just paying your normal rate. Next slide. And then one last innovative example is Oklahoma Gas and Electric, where they're implementing, this is an optional rate, something that they call variable peak pricing in the summer. Customers on this rate get a notification the day before the following day will be in one of 4 different categories: low, standard, high, or critical. So the utility, depending on system conditions, and I believe it's based on wholesale market prices, will apply one of these 4 prices and allow the customers to respond. Next slide. Next slide. Thank you, everyone. The key takeaways from my presentation today is that time of use rates and their more sophisticated cousins that I've touched on are important tools for the efficiency of the electric system to optimize future system costs. These key design choices are interrelated and should be considered together. And we really want to balance complexity and customer understanding so that people are comfortable as the rates get implemented. Thank you very much.
Hello. All right. Yeah, it's great to be here today. My name is Nick Bowden. I'm a manager at, with Ameren in the rates group. Yeah, I started with Ameren almost exactly 2 years ago, and it's been an interesting 2 years. For one, we just filed our second electric rate case in the time since I've been there. But also, I think there was a question this morning. I'm not sure which one of you asked, like, who has been to a conference already? And I thought, I didn't raise my hand. I've been to many conferences. But I think what you meant was who's been to a conference, you know, in the last 2 years or so. And I have not. You know, I have been working, like I said, for Ameren for 2 years, rarely even meeting my colleagues. So to be here with you all today and actually see some totally unfamiliar faces and speak to you is really a welcome opportunity for me. So I just want to jump in here and expand upon what Mark was talking about, just sort of generally about building time of use rates that accomplish the goals that we really want them to accomplish. And just to get a sense of the room, who here knows what a utility class cost of service study is? Okay, that's this. Oh, so we got, okay. So a few, because that's kind of fundamental to a lot of what Mark was talking about, and a lot of what we're really trying to actually do with time of use rates is we're trying to affect cost. And, you know, the things that affect cost are things that cause them. And that's this idea of cost causation. And by changing, you know, the time period or the prices in different time periods, we believe we can cause different costs and most notably make those costs lower. Okay. It's a common situation, I guess. So down is forward, I guess. Okay, so at Ameren, we have had historical time of use rates for what I guess is more than 20 years now. I don't really know the exact time period these have been affected for, but there on your left are the time of use rates for residential and small general service. The residential, I think, is the most recent addition of time of use rates. And there you can see there's kind of an on and off peak. It's a 2-period rate. And mostly what it's trying to do is discourage people from consuming electricity in that period between about 2 and 7 o'clock in the summer. That's when, you know, as the name on peak suggests, a lot is the system peak for load, and it's kind of that system peak which drives a lot of investment, a lot of cost in fixed capital. And then for the small general service, you can see we have a little bit of a wider peak and without such a great rate differential. and this kind of hits on one of the points, this illustrates one of the points I think that Mark was making, is like there's this trade-off between sending a strong price signal, right? The differential in the two levels in either one of those lines, sending that strong price signal in a very concentrated time period versus sending a slightly more muted price signal, a higher price during a wider period, so that you're more likely to actually affect the peak load. And then next to that on your right there is just a graphic representing time of use rates for our larger commercial and industrial classes of customers. And those are basically layered on top of the traditional rate design for those customers. And so they're essentially credits or premiums and credits against your bill for kilowatt hours within the peak and on-peak, peak and off-peak periods. And here's just sort of a representation of how many customers we've had historically on these historic time of use rates. You can see there on your right, small general service has actually had a sort of what seems like a much larger proportion of customers. It's about 7,500 customers out of 150,000 customers. But that's pretty concentrated on kind of one customer or a handful of customers with a large number of very small accounts. So that number actually looks maybe a little bit larger than really the load that it represents. And then for our largest customers, the LPS there, that lowest line, we have about 5 out of 60 total customers that have taken time of use rates historically. There's about 20 out of about 600 of our small primary service or SPS customers. And then, just a handful really of our LGS and residential customers, given there's about 50 customers remaining on our historic time of use residential rate out of 1 million. And then there's about 50 LGS customers, and that's out of about 10,000 customers. Okay, and things are kind of changing in terms of the time of use program at Ameren, and that's largely driven by this. The fact that Ameren is rolling out AMI or automated meter or advanced metering infrastructure so that we can actually have a diverse set of time of use rates that we can charge customers, and we can change the parameters of those rates over time and know more about specific load profiles of different customers so we can have better design of those rates to actually accomplish the goals we want to. And so this is just a schedule, a graphic showing the schedule of rolling out those AMI meters. So here we are, I think it's 2022. And so, well, it seems like a small geographic area. It's a large portion of the population that is in that small geographic area. So I think we're a little less than halfway through our rollout of AMI or smart meters. So the rollout of the AMI or smart meters had led to the development and now the deployment of a residential TOU program, time of use rate program. And that program involves 5 different rates. So who here is an Ameren, Missouri customer? Okay, it's about half of us. Who has a digital meter, an AMI meter, a smart meter? Does anybody not know what kind of meter they have? So if you go outside and you just look and see if there's like an LCD screen where it shows a number rather than some spinning dials. If you have, the LCD screen, then it's a smart meter. But yeah, it's something that, we send stuff in the mail. We reach out as much as we can to try to inform customers about the rollout of AMI and then the options they have to choose one of these rates. And so, we have these 5 rates. Anytime service is kind of our traditional flat rate that we have had for decades. And then there's an evening morning savers rate, which is once you receive an AMI meter, 6 months later becomes your default rate. So it's a 2-period on and off peak time of use rate, which will become the utility's default. You can switch back to anytime service, which means you just have a flat rate regardless of the time of day that you consume. But the evening morning will be the default. And then on top of those 2, we have 3 what we think of as advanced time of use rates. Overnight savers, smart savers, and ultimate savers. And so overnight is just, again, on peak, off peak rate. Smart savers has an off, intermediate, and on peak rate. Ultimate savers goes back to just on and off peak rate, but it also has a demand charge. Interesting concept in a residential market. There's a lot of information in this graph. So I sort of explained we looked at the graph of the historical rates, and basically what you're viewing here, is the hours of the day along the horizontal axis, in the price along the vertical axis. And so anytime users is our just traditional, and this is in the summer, anytime users are our traditional rate, it's just this flat line, right? It doesn't change. Regardless of the time period in which you consume energy, the price is always the same. Doesn't matter when you consume it. The rate is completely agnostic to when you're consuming energy. Therefore, you as the consumer can also be totally agnostic to it. Then we have this thing which will become our default rate, the evening morning. So nominally, it's a time of use rate. It has an on and off peak. But from where you're sitting, it's probably hard to see the difference, right? The differential between the price you pay between 9 a.m. and 9 p.m., which we're going to call the peak, very broad, like Mark was talking about. There's very little chance you're actually going to we're going to actually miss the peak load by making a 9-hour, on peak period. But the fact of the matter is, the rate is effectively the same. It's maybe not even 25 cents, maybe 17 cents more, or 0.17 cents more. 17 cents would be a lot. And then in the off-peak period, it's 33 cents lower, or 0.33 cents lower. So it's kind of getting at one of these other points I think that Mark mentioned a few times, is that customer understanding is a very important thing. People are used to I have a spinning disk meter outside. I have no idea, don't have to think about when I'm consuming electricity. At the end of the month, I consumed a certain amount of kilowatt hours. It doesn't matter when I did it or how I did it. That's how many I consumed, and I pay the same price for every single one of them. And now we want to, after, 100 years of experience that way, we want to fundamentally change the way that we're charging people. Not totally sure that they understand. And this is a pretty low risk way of doing that. You have a very small difference between the on and the off peak, but people get the chance to see it on their bill and maybe spend some time understanding that, and then realize maybe they want to do something that's more complex, where maybe they just save money because of the way that they've always consumed electricity, or, they like to get gadgets and program things, and they change their behavior and actually save money and help the utility in this at the same time, which ultimately helps all of the other customers, because when they reduce the utility's costs, the utility doesn't get to keep that money, right? We don't. It goes back to ratepayers in essence through the establishment of new rates and a rate case. So that's the whole thing here is, introducing customers to time of use by barely changing, what their rate structure is, and then offering some other options. Overnight is kind of aimed at specific loads that are overnight. So more or less just rewarding people. Maybe they have some load that's flexible that can be used at any time. I think the one idea that comes up is if you have an electric vehicle, right? That's a lot of load, a lot of electricity consumption that you could plug in overnight. And it may be maybe not equal to the rest of your house, but a large, percentage of the load from your home that you could plug in overnight and save some money, but then have to pay a little bit more during the day, but with a little additional, behavior change, or maybe not at all, you could actually have a better outcome given what might happen if you just plugged that electric vehicle in during the day on an anytime rate. That was summer. Those are the rates in summer I kept going. So those are the rates in summer. What you can see there is, the peak price, the high price is late in the evening. No, it's not late in the evening. It's early in the evening because that's when the utility experiences the highest, electrical consumption during the summer days. I needed that another explanation so that I wouldn't have to spend any time on this. Basically, same exact idea, but here in the winter time, the actual maximum electricity consumption by everyone on the system is happening early in the morning and late in the evening, right? And something I thought about, as I was thinking about my slides sitting there in the back, is especially in the context of all the discussion about heat pumps, which are pretty interesting technology. And I always not always, but for a long time, I understood how an air conditioner worked, right? And a heat pump is just an air conditioner that runs, heat in both directions. And I grew up more north in Illinois where heat pumps were kind of not really necessarily that cost effective, but I have a heat pump now at my home in St. Louis. And as I was thinking about that and what that means for my electricity consumption during the winter time relative to the summer, you could think about this graph, the prices that we charge people changing a lot in wintertime if people actually adopted heat pumps, right? The reason, why this is all low here is because we don't heat our homes with electricity. That's why that's low there. Right? As opposed to in summer, we do cool our homes with electricity. There's no natural gas air conditioner that I know of. There probably is, but not, you know what I mean. I'm sure technically some woman invented it, but some person invented it. Okay, so yeah, this is winter rates. I put 2 on there because it was supposed to come second, but at the last minute, without removing the 2, I exchanged it with this one, which was 1, but had an additional 2 lines on it that didn't make it any easier to understand. So yeah, basically this is, if you look at this doesn't make sense, right? This overnight savers, it doesn't make sense without these additional lines, because we have declining block tariff. Does anyone know what a declining block tariff is? Okay, so the same people who knew what a class cost of service study was. Because if you look, Oh, it was the surprise one. If you look here, the overnight savers is kind of everywhere below the anytime and evening morning. So you could save money just by going to the overnight if that was truly the rate, because it's always lower. But that's just because in wintertime, we decrease the price after you consume a certain amount of kilowatt hours. And that's a declining block tariff. But it makes the graph a little bit noisier. So the one additional thing that we don't normally see in residential rates are demand charges. So this is a charge for the maximum usage you have at any one point in time during the month. And our ultimate savers rate has that element to it, which I think is going to be an interesting experiment to learn from as we have more experience and collect more data on customers who choose this rate. And that's the next slide. Is this advanced time of use rate adoption. And we do have customers, maybe not a ton, but we do have customers voluntarily selecting these advanced time of use rates. And we do have customers not opting out of the new default rate. So I think that number says 250,000, which is about a quarter of our residential customers have not opted out of the new default rate. Opted out of the new default rate. And that number has grown in the last few months to be over 300,000. I'm going to skip that. This is what I said earlier about like the point of time of use rates is to save customers money, save the utility money, which then saves all customers money. Like that's the point of time of use rates. Prices are correlated with the load. The more load, the higher the price. React to the price, reduce load, save everybody money. Yeah. Something about renewable integration could be helpful. I know we're running out of time. Oh, then I got around to energy efficiency. Time of use rates increase the value of energy efficiency investments that benefit the system. I think that's true. Yeah, I think I went a little long.
That's okay.
But it's
That's right.
yeah, happy to take questions.
Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
All right, as we move to the question section here, we do have a question online. And as Travis said, is there any questions from the audience? Yes, one over here, and then I'll get back to Travis.
Hi, thank you. Had a question about the program in Maryland. So I'm actually from Maryland, and I didn't know that that was innovative. I was just curious, what's the data been on like, the actual effectiveness of that program and in other states looking to do something similar?
That's a question for me, I think. For better or worse, I'm not up on the latest, but I'd be happy to figure out if they've done evaluation and send it to Travis to send it along.
All right. Oh, right behind me.
So you hinted at this. I'm wondering if you guys have done any modeling to predict what the peaks would look like with 10, 20, 30, 40% heat pump adoption.
Yeah, it took a right turn there. It took a right turn there at the end. I thought you were going to say 20% adoption of time of use rates. And we have done some of that. That was one of the things that I skipped over. At the end there was a little graph with some, parabolic lines. And that was about if we had 20% adoption of time of use rates and how much it would reduce our peak. So I guess I have not. What others are thinking about in terms of not only increases of load, but fundamental changes in the daily load shape. Yeah, because I'm actually surprised at the level of electric space heating in Ameren's service territory. We can kind of infer it from the monthly usages when people have really high winter, and so it's not non-existent, and with changing climate becomes more feasible. So maybe it's becoming more worth looking at. But yeah, I don't.
All right, Nick, this one's going to be for you. This is from online. Does Ameren have goals for customer enrollment in those advanced time of use rates? And a follow-up, have you noticed any trends among customers adopting advanced rates or those who opt out of the default rates?
So in terms of explicit like numbers of customers, I don't know of any. I know there's a lot of work being done by data scientists, if you will, like the AMI data that is coming into the utility now is immense relative to the kind of metering data that we previously had. So I think we're trying to do a lot to understand customers, both who are on the rates and not on the rates, maybe more importantly, those who are not, and giving them information and education that will incent, just to allow them to make the choice. The default rate is such a minimal change in your bill, regardless of your load shape, that it doesn't appear to me that many people are opting for the anytime service when they're defaulted onto evening, morning. But I don't actually know the quantity of that, but just looking at the rate of increase of the customers who don't say no to the default, I guess is the way to say it. They don't say no. It's, I don't know if this is, I actually have a colleague, a coworker who's new at the company. And, I was talking to him about this default time of use rate policy. And I asked him whether or not he had an AMI meter and whether or not he had, chosen to stay with a default. And the answer was, I'm not sure. That's kind of why I asked earlier too, that because the effect is so limited, folks could stay with the default rate without even knowing. That's certainly not what we want. So yeah, the trends, I mean, just in the graphic that I showed there, and I've seen a few more months of data, they seem to be a relatively constant slope. And that's, I guess that kind of makes sense, is because these customers are making that choice when they get their AMI meter. So it's not a sign that, people are choosing later and later. I think it's just as people get an AMI meter, there's sort of a fixed percentage that say yes right away. So I think what will really be important is after that fixed percentage that just comes with the AMI meter, that's just like, yeah, I'll do that. That small percentage that says yes right away. I think the real test will be once the AMI is out there, can we continue to get new customers to sign up? Right? That'll be the real test. I think that was 2 of the 3 questions, maybe half of one of them. I'm not even sure. Was there a third one or?
No, I mean,
All right.
All right, everybody, if you can please join me in thanking Nicholas and Mark.
Thank you, everyone.
All right, so we have one more session, and it is something that really does tie in a lot of what we're talking about here today, the building energy exchanges in Kansas City and St. Louis, and the work that the 3 organizations leading those are doing. We do, before that, do have a break. There are snacks in the back to try and give you a little bit of jump start for that last session and your trip home. I do encourage you, please stick around for that. And we'll provide here a message from our sponsor, Spire. So thank you.